Thank you all for being with us. I'm honored that you're here, despite the snow. Someone obviously has to get God to check the calendar, remind the deity that it is October and not December or January. But I'm delighted to be here with you, and I'm delighted that you're here. Now, I have to begin by offering a word of caution. If you invite a theologian, you get a theological talk. And that's what you're going to get. And in doing this, I'm going to begin with what will appear a very strange question that has absolutely nothing to do with what we're talking about. But I'm going to argue that it does. And we're going to move from that question, with the help of Augustine and a poem of Gerard Manley Hopkins, to a very deep question indeed. And then, in my third part, I'm going to suggest a solution to the question. So, to begin with a very strange question. In the Confessions, in Book 3, St. Augustine asks an odd question, and he spends a good deal of time exploring this in the third book of the Confessions. It's not something he just tosses out and goes on. He really spends time exploring this, although he doesn't really answer the question. And he comes back to it in Book 4 and raises the same question, but in a bigger, a wider, and in some ways a more frightening context. And the question is, why do people like sad stories? Now, think about it for just a moment. The context in the Confessions is that Augustine has gone to Carthage, the largest city in North Africa. He, of course, was born in North Africa, but in a very tiny little town, Tagaste. He's gone off to Carthage to study. He is, in effect, doing his university studies at Carthage. And as he reflects on his life at that time, he mentions that he loved the theater. He absolutely loved going to plays while he was in Carthage. But that one of the peculiar things that struck him was that he very much preferred tragedies to comedies. He thought the comedies were sort of trivial and silly, and maybe even a little obscene. But tragedy he loved. A well-written, well-performed tragedy, absolutely marvelous. But, Augustine says, why would people want to go to a tragedy? Why would you go and spend money and spend time being made to feel sad? Wouldn't you think that feeling sad is something you'd want to get away from, not something you'd want to produce or create? Why would people like sad stories? As Augustine says, what we see being performed on the stage certainly are things we wouldn't want to happen to us, and we certainly wouldn't want them to happen to any of our friends or acquaintances. Why then are we delighted? Why is there something that pleases us about seeing them happen to these people in the story, in the play? Well, as I say, he doesn't answer the question. Of course, we can think of examples of that now. It wasn't too long ago, about 10 years ago now, perhaps 12, that motion picture theaters were filled with people watching Jack and Rose go down with the Titanic and weeping their eyes out. And people went 2 or 3 times to see Titanic. Why? Why in heaven's name? I mean, I could have told them, watch for the iceberg. Why would people go to see a sad story? Why do people like to be moved to tears? It's a very interesting question. As I say, he doesn't really answer it. He simply raises it. He comes back to it in the next book, Book 4, but in a much more serious personal context. He recounts in Book 4 how when he was back home in Tagaste, the little village he had been born in, a good friend of his, who was his own age, fell ill and after a few weeks died. And Augustine talks about the intensity of his grief at the death of this friend, his contemporary. And he speaks beautifully, movingly, to any of us who have lost loved ones, very insightfully. It's a wonderful and accurate description of so much of, I think, our experience. Augustine says that whenever he went anywhere, he only saw an absence. That when he went, all he was aware of was, my friend isn't here. He used to be, but now he's not. He's deep in mourning. And then he says, it requires immense courage, I think, to be willing to confront this in oneself, and an overwhelming courage to be willing to say it for others to hear. Augustine says, I finally came to the point where I realized that if some power said to me, I will restore to you your friend, and then you won't have to grieve anymore, that I would have said, thanks, let him stay dead. I'd rather grieve. That he had so fallen in love with grieving, that grieving was now so much, as it were, a part of him, that he really wasn't sure he'd want his friend back if it meant he couldn't grieve anymore. You see, it's the same question as the one he raised about going to the theater in Carthage. Why is it that we like to be sad? That's a marvelous question. And I'm going to suggest an answer using a poem of Gerard Manley Hopkins. This is, I think, one of Hopkins' very great poems. And Hopkins wrote many very great poems. But he entitled it Spring and Fall. But to those of us who love the poem, to those of us who are deep Hopkins fans, I think the poem is always known just as the Margaret poem. The Margaret poem. The context of the poem is this, but we know this from a letter of Hopkins in which he describes what led him to write this short poem. And as he describes it, he was visiting some friends, a married couple, who had several children, one of whom was a little girl, 4 or 5 years old at this time, whose name was Margaret. And while Hopkins was there visiting with her parents, Margaret came in from their garden in tears. It was the fall of the year, I guess around this time in the year. And the day before, their garden had been filled with trees with beautiful golden leaves. And Margaret had been terrifically excited about this and loved it, and got up that morning waiting to go out and see those beautiful golden leaves again. And the night, I suppose it had been a night like this. It was raining, the wind was blowing, and most of the trees were stripped of their leaves. And those beautiful golden leaves that the little girl had loved the day before are now turning brown and withering on the ground. And Margaret came in from the garden in tears because those beautiful leaves are all gone. In retrospect, thinking about that event, Hopkins wrote this poem. Margaret, are you grieving over golden grove unleaving? Leaves, like the things of man, you with your fresh thoughts care for, can you? Ah, as the heart grows older, it will come to such sights colder by and by, nor spare a sigh, though worlds of one would leave me a lie. and yet you will weep, and know why. Now, no matter, child, the name, sorrow's springs are the same. Nor mouth had, no, nor mind expressed, what heart heard of, ghost guessed. It is the blight man was born for. It is Margaret you mourn for. Absolutely brilliant poem. Margaret, are you in grief because the trees are unleaving? The leaves are going? You could get upset about leaves just as if they were being upset about human beings? Margaret, as you get older, this won't affect you anymore. But other things will. You'll still find reasons to weep. And perhaps you'll know why. Now, we don't have to name it now, child, because ultimately all sorrows have the same source. Nobody's told you this. You haven't thought it out. You haven't guessed it in your mind. No one has, as it were, whispered it to your heart. It's within you, Margaret. It is the blight man was born for. It is Margaret you mourn for. That what Margaret is really grieving for is that things pass away. Leaves and trees and people and Margaret all disappear. She may not be able to name it that way yet, but that's what she's already experiencing. The blight man was born for. It is Margaret you mourn for. I think that's exactly what Augustine is nudging us toward in the Confessions. That what Augustine wants us to see is the reason we like sad stories is because they give us the opportunity to cry. They give us the opportunity to express sorrow, because always underneath our lives, underneath the surface, for all of us, always there is a certain level of grief, fear, anxiety, sorrow. And we need opportunities to let it out. We feel absurd. I mean, it becomes a kind of almost ridiculous melancholy to be constantly wandering around crying on people's shoulders. So we look for acceptable occasions where we can let the grief out. And tragedy provides that, as the death of Augustine's friend provided it. What we feel is exactly what Aristotle said we ought to fear, we ought to experience in a great tragedy. You remember the Poetics, Aristotle famously says that the purpose of poetry, of tragic poetry, is to give us a catharsis of our emotions, a cleansing of pity and fear. Augustine would, I think, correct that a little bit by saying, yes, pity and fear, but underlying both of those ultimately is grief, sorrow, a sense of loss, which ultimately is about us. What is the root of all sorrow? Why is it that Gerard Manley Hopkins can say to little Margaret that ultimately all sorrows have the same spring? The root of that sorrow, the blight human beings were born for, according to Hopkins, is the fact that we're finite, the fact that we come to an end, the fact that we're limited. That's at the root of all of our griefs. And what we attempt to do is deny it. We attempt to cover that over. We attempt to get away from the fear, the grief, the reality of being finite. Augustine suggests three terrible ways in which we do this. If I may, I'll pull this together from all over the place at Augustine, because there's no single place that I'm aware of where he simply lays it out this way. But ultimately, there are three sources, I think, for Augustine. One is what he calls superbia in Latin, pride. But it's more than pride, it's a kind of arrogance. This is the attitude that tries to avoid that grief, that blight that human beings were born for, by saying, I'm fine. There's no sorrow at me. I'm not anxious about anything. I'm in perfect control of my life, thank you very much. I don't need anyone. I don't need anything. If you live, the only way you can ultimately maintain that attitude, it seems to me, is if you are preternaturally stupid or die very young. All you have to do is be awake and alive on the surface of the planet for enough time, and life will kick that out of you. One discovers that, there's a lot I don't control. There's all sorts of things that I'm worried about. There are all sorts of fears that I have to confront. There are all sorts of anxieties that are part of my life. A second way of avoiding it that one might flee to when that superbia, that arrogance, is no longer sufficient, is what Augustine calls curiositas. Obviously, our word curiosity, but he doesn't mean what we mean today by curiosity. He doesn't mean nosiness or prying into things that are none of our business. Curiosity for Augustine is a kind of dilettantism. It's spreading yourself too thin. It's an inability, certainly an unwillingness, to commit yourself to anything, to really give yourself to something. So we dabble at this, and we dabble at that, and we spend a little time doing this and a little time doing that, and we commit ourselves to nothing in the hope that nothing can let us down then. Nothing can be too big a disappointment because there's nothing we really care about all that much. We keep ourselves spread very thin. The third possibility, and this was the one that deeply worried Augustine because he saw it reflected in himself so clearly, is concupiscence. Concupiscence later on in the course of the Middle Ages came to have, the term, which Augustine meant as a very broad term, came to be narrowed until it meant almost exclusively lust. That's not what Augustine means by concupiscence. He's including that under concupiscence, but it's not, that's certainly not the sole meaning. Concupiscence for Augustine is absolutizing a relative good. It's when you take something that is a good and make it the good. When you take something that is of value and say it's the only thing valuable. It's to take something which may be perfectly fine, but to turn it into, in effect, God. That's all I need. And we all can do it. So Augustine points out over and over again. All I really care about is my family. Nothing matters in my life except my marriage. There is nothing more important than my career. My country, right or wrong. There is nothing more valuable than the church. Knowledge is the most important thing. If you haven't made your first million by the time you're 30, you're in big trouble. It's to take things which may be fine. Many of those things I just mentioned are wonderful, but none of them are God. And if we turn them, any one of them, into the important element in life, the thing that's central, that which will absolutely satisfy and complete me, we're saying it's God. You see, concupiscence is what the scriptures refer to as idolatry. It's to take a creature, maybe a very good creature, and turn it into God. That will keep me from worry, from fear, from anxiety, from grief, from despair. That will never let me down. And Augustine is inclined to think, indeed, if it doesn't, you're even in greater trouble. If it does let you down, maybe it will lead you to repent of idolatry. What is really to be feared is that you're able to scrape by, never confronting the fact that your God is an idol. Those are three ways that Augustine suggests we try and deal with this anxiety, this anxiousness, this grief that undergirds all of human existence. Before I turn to my odd suggestion about which, by the way, I feel very passionately, but before I turn to it, let me just point out how deep this goes. I would suggest to you that deeply rooted in both the Hebrew and the Christian traditions is the insistence that this anxiety about being a creature, this nervousness about being finite, this sense of fear and worry about the fact that we aren't the origin of our own being. We can't guarantee our own existence. We aren't the ultimate standard setters for the meaning of our existence. We are not the ultimate judges who rule on the worth and value of our existence. That for all of that, we go to someone outside us. The anxiety, the fear, the worry that produces, I think, in all of us, is the origin of evil in the Hebrew and Christian traditions. That's what evil comes from. Remember in chapter 3 of Genesis, the first temptation. Eat this and you will be like God. Remember in chapter 1 of Genesis, what was the first thing you heard about yourself as a human being? God made us in God's image and likeness. You see, the first temptation, the entryway for evil into God's creation, is not disobedience. That turns the whole story. It makes God a kind of petulant parent. You know, it's as if God said to Adam and Eve, now always look both ways before you cross the street. And the serpent said, there's no traffic here in Eden. Look one way, don't worry about looking both ways. And they do, and God says, you didn't look both ways, you're out. You know? It reduces God, as I say, to a sort of petulant disciplinarian. It's not pride. It is, I think, a kind of despair. It's a lack of appreciation of the value of being finite. You see, the origin of evil is, you think you're like God? You're not like God, you're a creature. Think of what creatures come to an end, they fall apart, they get old, they pass away. Think about being a human being. You start out, you have to teeth, and that hurts, and you learn to walk, and you've got to be toilet trained, and you go to school, and your adolescence is a mess for everybody, and you have the awkwardness of dating and trying to find a spouse, and you have to worry about raising your kids, and they go away to school and never write, and your eyes get bad, your hair falls out, your teeth rot away, and you get varicose veins, you lose your senses, and you die. You think that's like God? That's not like God. You've got to make yourself like God. You've got to go out. God's not going to give you godlikeness. You've got to go out and get it. You've got to go out and wrest it away from him. You've got to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. How? Well, start by eating this. Eat this, and then you will be like God, because you're not now. Whatever God has told you in chapter 1, there's nothing good about being creature. Being creature is the blight man was born for, to use the phrase from the Margaret poem. That's the origin of evil. As I constantly point out when I cite this as the origin of evil, Dante gets it completely right. Dante gets everything right. If you remember Canto 3 of the Inferno in the Divine Comedy, Virgil leads Dante to the entryway to hell. And what famously is carved over the gate of hell in Canto 3? Lasciate ogni speranza voi che entrate. Leave all hope, you who enter here. The entry to hell is hopelessness. And when you get to the depths of the pit of hell, when you get to Satan himself, Satan isn't like Milton's Satan in Paradise Lost, thundering out, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. Dante's Satan is locked in ice, made from his own tears, forever freezing. Satan for Dante is not Milton's monster of rebellion and pride. He's a monster of despair. It's all about finitude. If I could give you one more poet. The person who gets this exactly, nobody ever said it more clearly, it seems to me, than Goethe, the great German poet, probably the greatest of German poets. You remember that throughout his long life, Goethe worked on and off at a verse play, Faust. So we wrote it over the course of almost 40 years. And this is, of course, the familiar Faust legend, the man who sells his soul to the devil to get, depending on your version of the legend, the woman he loves, knowledge, endless youth, power, etc. Well, in Goethe's version of the story, when Faust first summons up the demon, Mephistopheles, he asks the devil, "Who are you?" And the demon gives two replies. Now, the first reply is brilliant, but I'm not going to talk about that because it's very compressed, and you really don't get it, I think, until you've read the whole thing through and started reading it the second time. And then you get, oh, I see what he's doing. What Mephistopheles says at first is, I am a part of that power that forever wills evil, but forever does good. And Faust says to him, that's a riddle. I don't want riddles. Tell me plainly who you are. And then Mephistopheles gives what I think is the most stunning and chilling description of evil that I have ever come across. Mephistopheles says, I am the spirit that says no, and rightly. Everything that exists comes to an end. Better there should never have been anything. I am the spirit that says no. Do you remember the New Testament? In Christ there is not yes and no, there is only yes. Well, Mephistopheles is the one in whom there's only no. No to what? No to everything. Is anything of value? No. Any possibility of growth? No. Change? No. Development? No. Any hope? No. Am I worth anything? No. Are you worth anything, Mephistopheles? No. It's all garbage. The whole thing is trash. Because it all comes to an end. In the German, it's zugrunde geht, goes to ground. It all falls apart. It's all finite. It has a finis. It comes to an end. Better nothing had ever happened. You see, the demon is the voice that says, in response to, let there be light. No, let it stay dark. Because none of it's any good. If it's not God, it's garbage. And if it's garbage, I can treat it like garbage. If I'm garbage, I can treat myself like garbage. And if you're garbage, I can treat you that way. That is the heart of darkness. That is the voice of despair. That is the anxiety about the possibility and value of being a creature, of being finite. No wonder we like sad stories. No wonder Augustine thinks we need a chance to let out our tears. No wonder Augustine tells us, of course we're frightened. Of course we're anxious. Of course there's an anxiety that underlies being a human being, being a creature. What is the response to that? Well, now, as I said, I'm going to make a suggestion to you, I'm not going to be able to trot out Augustine, although I think you find echoes of this in Augustine or in St. Thomas or lots of people, but there's no single place I can cite for this. I just present it as part of my experience and perhaps part of yours. The foundation, well, let me approach it this way. In answer to Mephistopheles, why is there anything at all? If Mephistopheles could say there shouldn't be, it's all junk. It all comes to an end. It's all finite. It's all a creature. It just let it pass away. Better there should never have been anything. What is our foundation? What do we claim is the foundation for all that exists? And of course the answer of the Christian tradition is love. Agapic love. It all exists because it's loved. The only reason anything exists at all is because God loves it into being. God has brought everything that exists into existence simply because God wants to give God's self to it. You see, there are only two reasons that the universe can ultimately exist. Either God gives something to the universe. God gets nothing from the universe. I mean, God is God. God doesn't need anything from the universe. God doesn't need us to tell God that God is glorious. God thinks so too. God does not need any voice to tell God, you're wonderful. God's noticed. God doesn't need us at all. Well, if God gets nothing from creatures, why is there anything? And the Christian answer is, because God gives something to creatures. It's not that he gets anything from them. They exist so that God gives something to them. And there are only two possibilities. Either God gives something that isn't God, but that's just more of the universe, or God gives God. Everything that exists so that God can give God's self to it. The whole of existence, absolutely everything. You, the chair you're sitting on, your pet cat, your favorite rhododendron, a little pebble on a moon going around the planet Uranus, a little crustacean crawling along the floor of the Pacific at this instant. Everything exists because God loves it, because God gives God's self to it. And what is the foundation which allows us to say that? What is the ground of our hope? I suggest to you that it's not the discovery that we're loved. It's great to discover that you're loved. It's wonderful to be told that you're loved. It's marvelous to feel oneself loved. But that ultimately is not the source of our hope. The source of our hope is the discovery that we are able to love others. It's not being loved, it's loving. That's the foundation of hope. It's not the discovery that God gives God's self to me. It's the discovery that I really can give me to somebody else. That I am genuinely capable of agapic love. That is the foundation of hope. All I have to do is appeal to your experience. I found a number of years ago, I started talking about this often with some people who at the time came to me for spiritual direction, and we explored this together. Have you ever had the experience, and I'm sure you have to be very, very young, I think, not to have had it. At some point we have this. Think of the times you have discovered, you have found yourself genuinely rejoicing in the goodness of the existence of someone or something else. Now, I'm putting it deliberately that way. Think of the times you found yourself, because it's not something you set out to do. It's not, now I'm going to love. Sometimes we can do that, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about experiences of sort of with a sense of shock, discovering that you really are absolutely delighted by the existence of that other. It may be somebody who's very close to you. It may be someone you scarcely know. But you find yourself absolutely delighted that the universe contains that one. What a whopping good thing it is that if that one exists. I think of, I have three little godsons who are the children of two of my former graduate students, and who've done me the great honor of asking me to be godson for each of the three boys as they came along. Well, there's a line in Babette's Feast, Isaac Dennyson's wonderful story, where one of the characters toward the very end says, "I have made a great discovery in the course of my long life. I have discovered that God is not outdone in generosity. You get everything you chose and everything you thought you gave up." Well, that's profoundly true, I think. What I have found with these three little godsons is these are the grandchildren I don't have. You get everything you picked, and you get everything you didn't. That God is not outdone in generosity. Well, I think of those three little lads. On the whole, that the asteroid wiped out the dinosaurs, that Columbus sailed, that Washington won at Yorktown. It's all fine with me if it ends up with a universe that produces those three little guys. Any universe that had to come about in order to bring them about, fine with me. They justify the whole thing. It's a rejoicing in the absolute goodness of their being. It is, I think, the point where we get closest to doing what God does. Remember in chapter 1 of Genesis, at the end of every day, God looked at it and saw that it was good. Well, these are the moments when we look at what's in front of us and say, God is right. It is good. What a wonderful thing that this, whatever this is, whoever this is, exists at all. Now, think of the times you've had that experience. And now let me ask this question. Think of the deep level of what you're experiencing, of that loving. What is your immediate, unreflective, spontaneous response to discovering that you're loving someone or something that way? I suggest to you, I can't prove this, I can only ask you to look at your experience and see if you find it true. I suggest to you that our immediate, unrehearsed response is gratitude, because we experience our capacity to rejoice in another's being as not something we do, but something that is given to us, enabling us to do it. That we don't experience that kind of love as our action, we experience it as a gift given to us so that we can act. The immediate, spontaneous response to the discovery that we are capable of agapic love is thank you. And whatever the you is, that's what you mean by God in the Christian tradition. God is the object of our spontaneous gratitude for the possibility of loving another. And that is the foundation of hope. It is absolutely essential that, and it's inevitable in our personal lives, in our individual lives as community, that we confront hard times, dark days. What do those dark days reveal? Well, always, most basically, what they reveal is it's scary being human. We can't, I mean, whose fault is it? It's everybody's and nobody's. You know? I mean, it's not as if there's, it would be very nice if we could say it was all Bernie Madoff's fault. I mean, he was responsible for the whole mess. If it weren't for Bernie Madoff, everything would be great. It's everybody who was willing to be improvident, to spend more than they had, to refuse to look to the future, to possess rather than to share. It's everybody. And what does that tell us? It tells us we ought to be nervous about ourselves. And these are the times to confront the nervousness. But undergirding that is the fact that we are still capable of infinitely rejoicing in the infinite goodness of the other. That is the ultimate foundation of our hope. Closing point. Let me offer you an alternative reading of a familiar phrase. Now, this is purely me. I can't cite anybody else for this. Again, I think I could get little fragments of the support for it from all over the place, but there's no single place I know where this is said quite this way. So it's got nothing behind it but me, and therefore is almost certainly true. Let me offer you an alternative reading of a familiar phrase in Catholic circles, beatific vision. The joy of heaven consists in the beatific vision, we are told by many, for example, by St. Thomas. We most often take that notion of vision in a kind of object sense. That is to say, the thing that's beatific, the thing that makes us blessed, the thing that makes us beatus, happy, the thing that fills us with joy, is what we're looking at. It's the object of our vision. Seeing God is our ultimate happiness. I have no problem with that. That's great. But I suggest to you there's another meaning of vision. Vision is not only the word we use to describe what we look at. Vision is the word we use to describe the power of seeing. And I suggest to you that it may be that second meaning that is the true joy of heaven. That the true joy of heaven is not that we see God, but that we see everyone and everything else in the way God sees them. We have God's vision. We see the whole thing as good, and we rejoice in it infinitely. So that we all get back to the afternoon of the sixth day, when God, having completed all his work, rested, and looked at it and said, "It is very, very good." And this time, we'll say, "You're right. Thank you very much." Now, I have a class at 11 that I'm going to dash to, and then I'll be back at lunch. But we certainly have time before then to take some questions or comments or observations or denunciations or vehement objections. Beat you into submission, did I? Please.
Yeah, I was interested in the distinction you made between the basis being our feeling love and then the capacity to love others. But I'm also thinking those two might be connected.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and thinking in pastoral work particularly. What do you do when you're sitting with somebody or working with somebody who is struggling with feeling love? And so you know that that's an issue, but you know that's not the end in itself.
Right. That's a wonderful question. We've all experienced this. There is certainly a very great truth to the claim that it's very difficult for someone to love another if that person has never been loved. The person who, I mean, we've all, I'm sure, met people, dealt with people who, in terrible circumstances, had a childhood in which they never felt really cherished, valued, loved, and have grown into adults who find it immensely difficult to love. That's profoundly true, that connection. I'm always nervous about making it absolutely true, because I cannot believe that ultimately what is done to one as a child makes an action as an adult impossible. It may make it very difficult, may make it very painful, it may make it make that action as an adult something that one really has to struggle and wrench oneself around to enter into. But to say it's impossible is, it seems to me, to say that someone is put outside the possibility of experiencing God by something that he or she had nothing to do with, that is not their responsibility. I simply can't accept that about human beings. We can make it very hard for one another to love, but I don't think anybody can absolutely deprive us of the possibility of loving another. I'd always be a little nervous about that, but you're quite right about the connection between the two. I think that certainly that connection is a very real and very strong one. Please. Right. Thank you. Yes, I think that's right. I think that Augustine Hopkins is right. There's a real sorrow just under the surface of being human. But under the sorrow, there's an even bigger joy. And that comes through. It bubbles through. Please.
Michael, thank you as usual. I guess my question is this: is a community sense of hope, is that simply the cumulative effect of everybody being hopeful in that community, or is there, an excess that's somehow there? So, okay.
That's a great question, Jane. I think there certainly is. There's this, every now and again, former students will do me the great honor of inviting me to help them prepare for their marriage and preside at their wedding. And I always warn them at the start that, remember, you've got somebody who's a celibate and who's got really cranky ideas about marriage, So take everything I say with a lot of salt. Take everything any celibate tells you about marriage with a lot of salt. We may have something true to say about marriage, but it's always by accident. One of the things I like to say to them is that if it is true, and I am absolutely convinced it is, if it is true, if the most often repeated statement in the Synoptic Gospels attributed to Jesus is true, and that statement, or the wording will differ from place to place a little bit, is the one who holds on to his life loses it, the one who gives it away sees it become everlasting life. That's true not only of individuals, it's true of communities. So I tell them, it's not enough for you to give yourself to her and for you to give yourself to him. If you want this marriage to live, you as a married couple have got to give your marriage away to other people. You don't, see, one of the things that so often, as you know, that so often gets missed about sacraments is every sacrament is ultimately received and celebrated for the sake of the community, not for the person who's getting the sacrament. You don't get baptized first and foremost because it's good for you. You get baptized because it's good for the church. You don't get confirmed because it's good for you. You get confirmed because it's for the good of the church. You don't get ordained because it's good for you. You get ordained, one hopes, for the good of the church. You don't receive the Eucharist for you first. It's for the good of the community. You don't come to the sacrament of reconciliation for you first, but for the community. And you don't get married for yourselves. You get married for the community. I mean, if it was simply for the good of these two people, well, that explains why they're happy. It might explain why their parents and their friends are happy. But why would the church, a community spread through time and space, 99.9999999% of whom will never meet these two people, why would the church care that they're getting married? It's because it's good for the church, ultimately. So that there's always a sense in which the community has to give itself away, not just the individuals who make up the community. If I could give you my favorite example for this. There are lots of, so many of you I know are involved in parish ministries, and so you know this. There have been so many in the last 30 years, parish renewal programs. Some better than others, almost all quite good. and some really superb, I think. But there's a problem, I think, connected with it. And the problem is, it goes back to when I was, when Dick Clifford introduced me, he mentioned I was, for my sins, dean of a seminary for 10 years. And one of the things that used to happen regularly when I was dean of the seminary was seminarians would come and say, we've got to have more community, we've got to build a sense of community. Oh, that's fine, you have a wonderful, grateful community. But the thing that invariably happened was they discovered that the absolutely infallible way to destroy a community is to say, let's have a community. It's like somebody coming up to you and saying, I want to be your friend. Well, thank you, you've just killed it. There's not the slightest possibility of our being friends now. And the same thing is true when we talk about a parish. If, and this is my favorite image for this, is if we get 100 people together in this room and we say, let's form a community, I give it at best 3/4 of an hour before there's blood on the carpet. But if you get 100 people together in this room and say to them, you know, down the hall, there's another 100 people, and they have an enormous problem with X, Y, and Z. What could we do to assist them? This 100 people will become a community. Community is, you can never aim at community. You get it while aiming at something else. It's always a byproduct. It's never a product. Well, I suggest that's always true of a parish. If you want to really renew a parish, in heaven's name, don't get people together and say, let's have a really wonderful parish. Begin by saying, what is it that this neighborhood needs? What is it that this town needs? What is it that the next parish over needs? And how are we going to respond to that? And along the way, this group of people will discover they've become a really vibrant parish community. And the same thing is true of marriage. You know, do not begin by saying, we're going to make a wonderful marriage with one another. Begin by saying, how does it benefit our families, our friends, our neighbors, the church, the world, that we got married to one another? And in answering that question, you'll really build a marriage. It's always a byproduct. So by all means, there's an overplus in the community. It's not simply the sum total of the individuals making it up. Please.
You spoke of this anxiety about personal mortality that really we try to hide and express. Do you think that the church as an institution is going through this exact same process?
What? A shockingly perceptive question. Oh, yes. Yeah. Oh, the church, like all things human, and the church is human as well as divine, like all things human, the church experiences terrific fear and anxiety about its own finitude. And what it does is denounce its own finitude. We have the truth, absolutely. You know, doctrine never changes. Dogma doesn't develop. There's no need for further growth. It's all there as it ought to be from the start. Everybody else has things to learn. We simply know. You know, if that's not what Augustine called superbia, I don't know what is. There's also a kind of ecclesiastical curiositas. Keep busy about a dozen different things and never confront the big questions. You know, let's start another committee. Let's have a committee about the committee. Well, first we will have to form a committee to discuss who's on the committee that is going to describe the committee. What we do is we keep ourselves busy, and there's an illusion that something is being accomplished. And concupiscence, as I mentioned. All I need is family, country, church. You know, if I may speak purely personally, a long time ago, but after I was ordained, I had to confront the fact that I thought I loved the church a good deal more than I loved God. I put up with God, but I really loved the church. And I think to turn that around is an immense work of conversion that is still going on. But the church certainly confronts this. And it's the reason for sort of institutional anxiety. And of course, how do people respond to anxiety, as Augustine points out about Superbia? You do it by making ringing statements that there's nothing to be anxious about. You know? It's the, well, if I can use my own gender as an example, it's the oft-observed fact that men don't like to ask directions. I know just where we are. I don't need to look at the map. I know exactly where we are. But the more he insists he knows exactly where he is, the more absolutely certain you can be you're hopelessly lost. There is I think of this often when people at leadership positions in the church or in any society say, remember, I'm speaking with authority. The one thing you can be absolutely certain of is that if a person has authority, he or she never has to say, I have authority. The people who really have authority are the people who don't have to say it because everybody simply acknowledges it. You know? It's the person who at some level knows they don't think I have authority that has to say, I have it, you know. It's a response to institutional anxiety, and it's very real in the community. It's true in a nation. It's true. You see it in families, but you certainly see it in the church. Please.
You talked about hope, and the topic of the seminar is about hope in the future. So do you believe that hope is here now? And how do I, as an individual, engender the hope that I believe is a part of humanity?
Excellent. Yeah, hope is here and now. The object of hope is always in the future, but the act of hope is always in the present. You know, what you hope for lies in front. That you're hoping is what you're doing at this minute. And how you engender it? Love. Love is always the answer. Love is the answer. What is the source of faith? Love. What is the source of hope? Love. What is the source of love? Love. It's all about love. But it's not, as I try to suggest, I think, it's not being loved, it's loving. That's the foundation for our hope. So how do you do that? How do you engender that in others? Invite them, lead them, point out to them that they're already in situations where they should love. It's about self-gift. It's ultimately about self-gift. So that I wasn't going to use this, but I will mention it. My mother is 90 and dealing with dementia and is in a nursing home, and I go pretty much every evening to be with her. And she knows me, and much of the time she remembers the name Michael. She doesn't remember I'm her son, and she has no notion that I'm a priest. Every Sunday when I'm there to celebrate Mass for her and the other residents at the nursing home, she's shocked to say, "You're a priest?" Because often when I'm with her in the evening, she'll say, "How's your wife?" And I always say to her, "You know, I've been so busy I scarcely see her." How many children do you have, etc. But a couple of weeks ago, 3 or 4 months ago now, beginning of the summer, one evening, she didn't seem to be connecting particularly well that evening at all. And I said to her, "Do you remember who I am, darling?" And she said, and she looked at me a long time, really pondering me, and she said, "I think you're someone that I love very much." And the thing that struck me was she didn't remember me as somebody who loved her, because that's secondary. She remembered the most important thing, that she loved me. You may not always remember why you loved, but you never forget that you do. Thank you very much.